This is the Blackprint, where being black is always the topic of conversation. The Blackprint is brought to you by Rhymes and Designs and Good Evil Art. Welcome back to the Blackprint. It's your host, MJ. Today we'll be continuing our conversation of the Brown v. Board decision. Back when Brown v. Board came down in 1955, most black people thought it was this amazing decision that was going to lead to all of this progress, that they had been fighting for something and they had finally gotten something that they viewed to be just, that was going to, improve the conditions for black people in this country. But there are several influential people who didn't see Brown v. Board as a good thing. And one of those people was Zora Neale Hurston, the acclaimed, amazing author. And when the decision came down, she wrote a letter called Court Order Can't Make Races Mix. And Zora Neale Hurston felt that the decision offended her integrity. She said, "The whole matter revolves around the matter of self-respect of my people. How much satisfaction can I get from a court order for somebody to associate with me who does not wish me near them? I regard the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court as insulting. I see no tragedy in being too dark to be invited to a white social affair." And then there was also W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was opposed to the decision as well. It was a chapter in one of his books, and he started out the section with some statistics. So at the time, there were 2 million black children being taught by 48,000 black teachers. There were also less than 500,000 black children in the North, and these children were largely taught by white teachers. During this time, there were 79 HBCUs, and those students were taught by thousands of black teachers. And W.E.B. Du Bois felt that separate institutions were necessary for the proper education of people. He wrote, "The proper education of any people includes sympathetic touch between teacher and pupil, knowledge on the part of the teacher, not simply of the individual taught, of the pupil's surroundings and background and the history of their class and group. Such contact between pupils and between teacher and pupil on the basis of perfect social equality, as will increase the sympathy and knowledge, facilities for education and equipment and housing, and the promotion of such extracurricular activities as will tend to induct the child into life." So that was W.E.B. Du Bois's definition of how to properly educate a people. He couldn't understand how integrating institutions, especially considering the present attitude of white America, which is animosity for black people, how integrating the institutions would help black people, would help black children. He also said, "There are many public school systems in the North where Negroes are admitted and tolerated, but they are not educated. They are crucified. There are certain northern universities where Negro students, no matter what their ability, desert, or accomplishment, cannot get fair recognition, either in classroom or on the campus, in dining halls and student activities, or in common human courtesy." I don't know if you all have been paying attention to all these stories in the media, but that sounds very familiar to me. In 2017, a black person was the first to do this at this institution. A black person was the first person to do that at this institution. It's like, is that because that was the first black person to pursue it, or were they discouraged, or were they not accepted in the first place? All of these incidents where people are spray painting, the N-word, and they're hanging Confederate flags, and they're stringing up dolls by their neck, throwing parties and dressing in blackface. All these crazy, racist, horrible things happening in 2016, 2017, and 2018, 2019. And W.E.B. Du Bois said this 60 years ago, and not much has changed in that regard, because you can't take away someone's animosity for a group of people by integrating them. You're just taking a population of people who probably is already vulnerable and making them more vulnerable. And of course that leads to lower self-esteem, lower belief that you're capable, a level of discomfort where it can interfere with your ability to perform. You know what I'm saying? There are identity crises where people want to separate themselves from being black, or they want to be like, I'm not that kind of black person. And they really do feel the pressure to, represent for an entire group of people. And it just makes the whole educational experience that much more difficult for black children. And then not to mention when you have to compete with people and you never had access to the resources that they had access to. To me, integration has largely set the black community up for failure. W.E.B. Du Bois was also concerned that black teachers would lose their jobs. And he was right. And he was right in a major way. He also felt that would have an overall negative impact on teaching as a profession for black people. So, following Brown, 38,000 black teachers and administrators in 21 southern and southern bordering states lost their jobs. Official language concerning black teacher retention was included in neither the Civil Rights Act of 1964 nor the subsequent federal desegregation guidelines for 1966. In the 1970s and 1980s, further reduction of black educators occurred as more desegregation orders were enacted and new teacher certification requirements imposed. If the number started out as 48,000 and immediately 38,000 teachers lost their jobs, and then after the 38,000 black teachers lost their jobs, more black teachers lost their jobs, the question is, why does integration mean that black teachers lose their jobs? Because it's okay for black children to be educated by white people, because that's what our country says, but it's not okay for the white children to be educated by black teachers. I wonder why. When you look at the numbers now, in 2011, 84% of public school teachers were white. 7% of public school teachers were black. If you look at the population, the overall population, if you look at the racial composition of public schools, 16% of the students are black, 25% Latino, and 50% white. According to the Department of Education, over 8 million black children attended public schools, while around 430,000 attended private schools during the 2009-2010 school year, which means that approximately 95% of black children attended public schools during that school year. 95% of our children were taught by a population of people that was about 84% white, 7% black. Makes you really think about the intentionality of the school to prison pipeline, doesn't it? In the 80s, 94% of teachers were white in the public school system. I think a Malcolm X quote sums it up pretty well. Only a fool will let his enemy teach his children. And on with all of, with the current administration and this idea of getting rid of the public schools, without any black teachers, without resources, how are black children going to be educated? How are non-white children going to be educated? Another big thing I think about integration was that black people lost their ability to control their children's education, the educating of their people. Just look at the rise of standardized tests, which most teachers and a lot of, experts say that these standardized tests aren't really representative of, intelligence. They're not representative of a person's ability to succeed, to be successful in society. These standardized tests have been proven to be culturally biased. They're biased towards wealthy students. If you look at the difference between the SAT, wealthier students just do better than students of a lower SES. And it's like, you can't tell me, not me personally, that wealthier people are more intelligent. From what I've seen, a lot of wealthy people are not more intelligent. They're not as hardworking. They just have the ability to buy results. They buy tutors. They pay for tutors, pay for these prep courses for these exams. Their core curriculum is built on, the principles of the standardized test, so they track perfectly. There have been studies where it shows that as the income level for families rises, their SAT score increases by 12 points. If you go up all these tax brackets and you're getting 60 points based on the fact that you have more money than somebody else, you're going to edge a lot of people out when those two individuals are applying for schools or scholarships. Recently, the SAT was redesigned, and the College Board, which owns the SAT, said they were gonna, they're gonna level the playing field. They're gonna make it as fair as possible. And they did this thing where they added all of these math problems that have a lot of words, very wordy math problems. And a lot of people felt that that would disadvantage English as a second language students and students who have traditionally struggled on the SAT, which is generally, Black and Latino students. So even though they got a lot of negative feedback, they got a lot of criticism, they went ahead with it anyways. What Black people also lost with integration was the possibility of having quality schools. This happened for multiple reasons. One of the big reasons was white flight. When the court order came down for community schools to be integrated, white people immediately started moving away from these areas that Black people were moving into. So when non-white people move in, white people move away. That's white flight. And the thing about white flight is that when those white people would leave those areas, they would take a lot of the resources that only they were afforded with them by fleeing to these suburbs. Where white people move now, it's different. There's the conversation of gentrification and all of these things. But back then, they moved from the inner city to the suburbs. These days, they just take over parts of the inner city, all these little enclaves, of separated communities where it still can dictate the quality of the schools in those districts. By moving to the suburbs, they excluded Black people from employment, housing, and educational opportunities. And this was presented in something called the Kerner Report, which was studying this white migration to the suburbs. And the report's famous conclusion was that our nation is moving toward two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. I found this great quote from an article called The Failure of Integration from the Center for American Progress. The predictable patterns of urban concentration of Blacks and the minority poor and suburban concentrations of whites and the affluent emerged through conscious public policies and a great deal of discrimination against Black people. One of the other big things that was happening during that time was redlining. Redlining refers to a discriminatory pattern of disinvestment and obstructive lending practices that act as an impediment to home ownership among African Americans and other people of color. Banks use the concept to deny loans to homeowners and would-be homeowners who lived in these neighborhoods. This in turn resulted in neighborhood economic decline and the withholding of services or their provision at an exceptionally high cost. Federal housing agencies, including the Home Owners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Association, determined whether areas were deemed unfit for investment by banks, insurance companies, savings and loan associations, and other financial services companies. The areas were physically demarcated with red shading on a map. In contrast, zones which were to receive preferential lending status were marked in green shading and intermediate areas in blue shading. Often these decisions were arbitrarily based on the area's racial composition rather than income levels. While the practice was almost universal before 1968, the Civil Rights Act passed that year theoretically outlawed redlining. Nonetheless, its impact was felt long after that date. As a consequence of redlining, neighborhoods that local banks deemed unfit for investment were left underdeveloped or in disrepair. Attempts to improve these neighborhoods with even relatively small-scale business ventures were commonly obstructed by financial institutions that continued to label the underwriting as too risky or simply rejected them outright. When existing businesses collapsed, new ones were not allowed to replace them, often leaving entire blocks empty and crumbling. Consequently, African Americans in those neighborhoods were frequently limited in their access to banking, health care, retail merchandise, and even groceries. One notable exception to this was, and still is, the proliferation of liquor stores and bars, which seemingly transcended the area's stigma of financial risk. Redlining also led to an appreciable dearth of employment opportunities in these neighborhoods, as prospective small-scale employers were disinclined to locate there. Crime often followed in the wake of those declining neighborhoods, making future investment less likely. These developments created a cycle which seemingly justified the initial redlining practices. That was an excerpt from blackpast.org, and it's called Redlining 1937 until now. So when white people moved from the inner cities to the suburbs, another reason that communities were devastated, schools were devastated, was because of taxes. Property taxes is one of the funding avenues for public education. Public education is funded by the state and the federal government, and property taxes and other local sources. The average support for public education from property taxes and those other local sources is around 44%, and property taxes make up the majority of that funding. The way that works is that the local government collects taxes from residential and commercial properties as a direct revenue source for the local school district. When you have these wealthier areas, they are able to contribute more property taxes to their schools, which, improves the quality of the resources, the facilities, and potentially the credentials, I guess, of the educators, so the quality of education for their children. You also had interventions from the federal government, like the No Child Left Behind Act, and it was basically that government funding would be afforded to schools based on their ability to meet certain performance standards by district. So if your district improved each year along these markers, notably standardized tests, then your district will receive more money. But when your district continued to perform poorly, the government would take more and more and more money away from those schools. So when a district wasn't performing, they would take money from the districts that needed it the most. And this ended up gutting so many lower income communities because they just didn't have the resources to improve the education in the district, especially when they were receiving less money each year. They were being penalized each year. They couldn't pay teachers. In my school district, sometimes it would be 45 students to one teacher. We have books from the 90s, and I graduated in 2009. How do you expect people with very little resources and less resources each year? And these children tend to have, less resources at home. How do you expect them to improve each year or to improve at all when you continue to take very important funding away from them? What's interesting to me about the Brown v. Board decision is that this whole idea of ending segregation, 60 years later, the United States of America is more segregated than it's ever been. So it didn't work to end segregation, just legal segregation. And then it's like, there are crafty ways to perpetuate even legal segregation that wasn't done away with by the Supreme Court. Integration didn't end racism. We see so many instances every single day that makes us very aware that racism still exists. So how did Brown v. Board change our lives, the lives of Black people, in a positive way? I think, considering what I've read, I've come to the conclusion that it did us more harm than good. The way they went about it did us no favors, doing away with black teachers, not creating any real standards for the treatment of students after integration. So that's just my opinion of Brown v. Board. I felt like it was necessary to present the case in a different light, encourage people to always be critical just because it looks good, just because it sounds good. The U.S. government has done what exactly that was good for black people? I feel like there is a double-edged sword no matter what it is, and you just have to know the end goal and to combat that. So that was my talk on Brown v. Board of Education. I'm going to end this segment with a song called Water by Kidepo.
I've grown to know the amber glows and showers on the walls. I've made amends and making friends with the fibers on the carpet. A house, a home to set the tone, or pretend to settle down. But on we'll go, for winds will blow your bare feet light as a feather. I walk from the mountain to the warm dead sea, and all the trials I'll know to be at peace. 'Cause boundless love is where the water is. I've packed a bag that's bound to drag behind like a stubborn child. We'll run, we'll fly, and follow signs for the fountain of redemption. Desert roads will be my therapy. Oh, I need to see the end. I walk from the mountain to the warm dead sea, and all the trials I'll know to be at peace. 'Cause boundless love is where the water is. It's where you are, it is. It's where you are, it is. It's where you are, you are. Boundless love is where the water is.
That was Kidepo with Water. Please remember to like and share this video and subscribe to our channel. Also, if you have any questions or suggestions, please leave a comment in the comment section. That was the Blackprint, and this is MJ, sending you love, peace, and ammunition.